there is a quiet discomfort hidden inside the way history is usually told. A subtle tension, almost imperceptible, like a breath being held for too long. If human civilization truly began only once, if everything followed a clean and linear ascent, from stone tools to satellites, then why does the record feel scraped thin in places, as if something older once lived there and was carefully removed? And, before you allow your body to sink completely into this comfort, take a very small moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in what I'm describing makes you feel like staying a little longer. If you wish, you can share where you are and what time it is as you listen. I've always been curious about the small points of light drifting together through the night. The earliest chapters of human history arrive already damaged, not violently torn, not dramatically erased, but softly incomplete. Entire ages seem to dissolve into silence, leaving behind only fragments. A tool without a workshop, a structure without a blueprint, a myth without a beginning. Archaeology, which should have given us a steady ladder backward through time, instead reveals staircases that suddenly end in mid-air. What unsettles many researchers is not what we do not find, but where the absences appear. Long periods where nothing accumulates, followed by sudden bursts of complexity. Agriculture, monumental architecture, astronomy, mathematics, all appearing as if recalled rather than invented. As though humanity did not climb these ideas step by step, but reached back towards something already known, faintly remembered, half erased. The geological record deepens this unease. Earth does not preserve memories gently. It folds, melts, floods, and grinds its own surface. Entire coastlines vanish. Civilizations built at sea level where trade and life naturally gather would leave little behind after a single catastrophic rise in ocean levels, and there have not been one or two such rises, but many. Sea levels have surged more than 100 meters multiple times in the last few 100,000 years. Each time, coastlines, the most likely cradles of early civilization, simply disappear. Yet even accounting for this, something remains off balance. There are technologies that seem to arrive too quickly. Stonework whose precision rivals industrial methods, alignments to celestial cycles that require centuries of observation. These are not isolated curiosities. They repeat across continents, not identically but rhythmically, like variations of a song remembered differently by different cultures. The stories people told themselves preserve something that stone could not. Flood myths emerge independently across the world, describing not just destruction, but renewal, a cleansing, a restart, a narrowing of survivors who carry fragments of old knowledge into a quieter, diminished world. These stories do not describe progress, they describe aftermath. Some scholars dismiss these accounts as metaphor, psychological echoes of local disasters. Others notice how strangely specific they are. References to stars that no longer rise where they once did, to climates that no longer exist, to gods who withdraw after teaching essential skills. The language shifts subtly from creation to recollection. Even the timeline of human evolution is marked by pauses and accelerations. Long stretches of stability interrupted by sudden cognitive leaps. The emergence of symbolic thinking, art, complex language, each appears rapidly, then stabilizes. Not as a smooth curve, but as a staircase with missing steps. If Earth has reset civilization more than once, the resets would not announce themselves. They would not leave neat borders in time. They would blur memory, compress history, and favor survival over continuity. Knowledge would fragment. Techniques would simplify. Stories would carry what tools could not. And those who came later, those who rebuilt, would naturally assume they were first. History, then, would not be a record of beginnings, but of resumptions. Each civilization believing it stands at the start of everything, unaware it is walking on the thinned remains of something older, something already tried, already broken, already lost to water, fire, ice, or silence. The most unsettling possibility is not that ancient civilizations existed before us. It is that they may have reached a familiar height, that they faced recognizable limits, that the erasures were not accidents, but outcomes. If that is true, the question is no longer whether the past has been reset, but how many times it has happened without being noticed, and whether the present too is quietly approaching one of those invisible thresholds. For now, the record remains incomplete. The gaps remain unfilled, and the silence between them continues to hum, asking not for belief, but for attention. What follows that first suspicion is not clarity, but texture. The kind of texture that appears when a surface has been sanded down again and again, until the original shape can no longer be reconstructed, only inferred from irregularities. Archaeology, at its most honest, often feels like this, not a revelation of what was, but an encounter with what no longer fits. Across the world, early civilizations appear with a strange confidence. They do not stumble into complexity. They arrive already knowing where to build, how to organize labour, how to orient stone toward the sky. The earlier cities in Mesopotamia show administrative systems fully formed. In the Nile Valley, monumental architecture emerges with precision that seems indifferent to trial and error. In the Americas, urban planning appears with ceremonial geometry that suggests long rehearsal, yet no rehearsal stages remain. What troubles some researchers is not the existence of these cultures, but the absence of their apprenticeships. There are no clear sequences of failed attempts, no long archaeological trails of gradual improvement that one might expect from experimental learning over millennia. Instead, there are gaps, silent intervals in which nothing accumulates, followed by sudden coherence. This pattern repeats often enough to feel intentional, though intention may not belong to any single actor. The soil itself seems complicit. Entire occupational layers vanish. Sites that should have yielded centuries of debris instead present abrupt transitions, as though someone had swept the floor clean before allowing life to resume. Geology offers one explanation, but not a comforting one. Sedimentary records reveal cycles of extreme instability, rapid climate shifts, sudden flooding, prolonged droughts, volcanic winters. These are not subtle events. They are capable of erasing coastlines, collapsing ecosystems, and forcing survivors into smaller, more fragile networks. Under such pressure, knowledge does not disappear evenly. It fractures. Skills that can be memorized survive longer than those that require infrastructure. Oral cosmologies endure where metallurgy fades. Symbolic forms persist where complex supply chains collapse. What remains afterward can look deceptively primitive, not because the people were incapable, but because they were conserving what little could still be carried forward. And then, centuries or millennia later, when conditions stabilize, civilization reappears, not as a continuation, but as a resurfacing. The old knowledge is no longer explicit. It returns as instinct, as myth, as ritualized habit. Builders know how to stack stone without remembering why the angles matter. Astronomers align structures with solstices without recalling who first counted the years. There are places where this resurfacing is especially difficult to ignore. Stone platforms that predate the cultures built upon them. Roads buried beneath later roads. Foundations reused because they were too well made to abandon. Each layer tells a different story, yet they share a quiet dependency. The question arises gently at first. How many layers are missing? Conventional timelines tend to compress prehistory into a narrow band of time, assuming stasis where evidence is thin, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially on a planet that actively recycles its own surface. Ice sheets advance and retreat, rivers relocate, tectonic plates consume coastlines. The oldest human settlements, those most likely to have supported advanced trade and communication, would have been placed precisely where destruction is most efficient. This realization shifts the emotional tone of the investigation. What seemed like progress interrupted begins to feel like survival redefined. Civilization becomes not a ladder, but a pulse, a pattern of emergence, collapse, forgetting, and remembering, never identical, but never entirely new. Even tools tell this story if listened to carefully. Some early artifacts display refinement beyond what their surrounding context would predict, not impossibly advanced, but quietly confident. As if made by hands that had done this before, even if the makers themselves could no longer explain how the knowledge came to them. The discomfort deepens when these patterns appear independently across the globe. Similar transitions, similar silences, similar sudden coherence. Not synchronized, but resonant, like echoes of the same disturbance heard from different distances. If civilizations have reset more than once, the resets would leave behind precisely this kind of archaeological unease. Not ruins everywhere, but interruptions. Not monuments announcing their loss, but questions embedded in stone and soil. The kind of questions that resist closure. And perhaps that is why history feels so carefully bounded. Why timelines are drawn with confident lines where uncertainty should linger. To admit multiple resets is to admit that continuity is fragile, that progress is not guaranteed, that the present may not be the culmination, but merely another phase between silences. The fragments do not accuse, they do not insist, they simply remain, slightly out of place, waiting for someone to notice that they do not belong to a first attempt. As this awareness settles, it becomes harder to look at any ancient site without wondering what lies beneath the visible layer. What older floor was built over? What memory was simplified into ritual? What knowledge was reduced to symbol because nothing else could carry it forward? And if the past contains more interruptions than we are comfortable acknowledging, then the question shifts again, not toward what was lost, but toward what is always lost first, and what, if anything, ever survives intact. The ground does not answer. It only holds its silence a little longer. When the conversation turns from missing layers to missing worlds, the scale quietly changes. What once seemed like a human problem becomes planetary. The Earth itself enters the narrative, not as a passive stage, but as an active participant, one that has never promised stability. There is a moment in deep time, roughly 12,000 years ago, when the planet behaves strangely. After a long warming trend at the end of the last ice age, temperatures abruptly fall again. Glaciers halt their retreat. In some regions they advance. Winds strengthen. Ecosystems fracture. This interval is known to geologists as the Younger Dryas, though the name carries none of the unease implied by its effects. It was not a gentle cooling. It was sudden, violent, disruptive enough to redraw the conditions under which any large organised society would have struggled to survive. What caused it remains debated. Some point to massive meltwater pulses that disrupted ocean circulation. Others suggest cometary debris, atmospheric dust, or cascading feedback loops within the climate system. No single explanation satisfies every line of evidence, but the outcome is not disputed. A global shock that arrived too quickly for adaptation. And it did not happen only once. Ice cores, sediment layers, and isotope ratios tell a story of repeated upheavals. Periods of relative calm punctuated by abrupt resets. Sea levels rising not gradually, but in surges. Shorelines migrating inland by kilometres within a human lifetime. Regions once fertile becoming uninhabitable. Others briefly blooming before collapsing again. Civilization, if it existed in any structured form before these events, would have faced an impossible test. Cities built near water would drown. Agricultural calendars would fail. Trade networks would fracture. Writing systems, if they existed, would be useless without institutions to sustain them. What survived would not be archives or monuments, but people. And people, when pressed to survive, carry only what fits inside memory, This is where catastrophe and myth begin to overlap without fully merging. Stories of floods, fire from the sky, darkness lasting for years, these appear across cultures separated by oceans. The language differs, but the emotional tone is consistent. These are not creation stories, they are aftermath stories. They speak of loss first, then renewal. Skeptics often argue that such myths simply reflect local disasters amplified by imagination. Yet the timing is unsettling. Many flood narratives point back to the same broad window in prehistory. Many describe rising waters not as seasonal events, but as world-ending thresholds. And many emphasize a small group of survivors who preserve fragments of knowledge, agriculture, astronomy, law, while the larger world forgets. Catastrophe does not need to erase everything to reset civilization. It only needs to break continuity. Once generational transmission is disrupted, once specialists are lost, once infrastructure collapses, knowledge simplifies. Precision yields to ritual. Explanation yields to symbol. What remains looks primitive not because it is, but because it has been compressed. This compression may explain why ancient cultures appear obsessed with cycles. Time for them is rarely linear. It loops, it resets. Ages rise and fall. Worlds are destroyed and remade. These are not comforting philosophies. They are survival frameworks, ways of understanding existence on a planet that repeatedly proves unstable. Even astronomy bears the imprint of this awareness. Precessional cycles, slow shifts in Earth's orientation that take nearly 26,000 years to complete, were tracked long before modern instruments. To notice them requires patience across centuries. To care about them suggests a civilization thinking far beyond immediate survival. And yet such knowledge appears embedded in cultures we otherwise describe as early. How did they know what they could not have observed within a single lifetime? One possibility is cumulative observation over many generations. Another is inheritance. Not genetic, but cultural, passed down imperfectly after something broke, after something ended. When catastrophe resets the board, it does not erase curiosity. It narrows it. Survivors ask different questions. Not how to expand, but how to endure. Not how to invent, but how to remember just enough. This reframes the archaeological record yet again. The absence of advanced artifacts does not necessarily imply absence of advanced thinking. Tools decay, metals corrode, coastal cities vanish. But alignments carved into stone, stories woven into ritual, numbers hidden inside myth, these persist longer. They are resilient precisely because they do not announce themselves as technology. If civilization has been reset multiple times, then each reset would have favoured certain kinds of knowledge over others. Practical survival skills, symbolic compression, cosmic orientation. What we find today may be the residue of what could not be easily destroyed, and what we do not find may simply be what required calm to exist. The idea is unsettling not because it challenges progress, but because it challenges uniqueness. It suggests that the present moment is not special by default, that intelligence, organisation and ambition may have arisen before, only to be humbled by forces beyond negotiation. In this view, extinction is not always biological. Sometimes it is cultural. Sometimes it is memory itself that goes extinct, leaving behind only faint impressions that later generations mistake for beginnings. The planet has no obligation to preserve our achievements. It never has. Its rhythms operate on scales that ignore monuments and economies alike. When those rhythms accelerate, when thresholds are crossed too quickly, civilization becomes just another layer, thin, fragile, and easy to miss. As this realization settles, a quieter question emerges beneath it. Not whether catastrophe has reset civilization before, but whether such resets follow patterns, whether they arrive randomly or rhythmically, whether they are accidents or consequences, And if the Earth has pressed the reset button before without warning, what tells us that it will not do so again, just as silently, just as efficiently, leaving future historians to wonder why our record too feels scraped thin? For now, the planet offers no reassurance, only precedent, and a long memory written in ice, stone, and absence. After catastrophe fades into distance, what remains is rarely chaos. What emerges instead is order, quiet, deliberate, and often far too precise for the conditions assumed to have produced it. This is where stone enters the conversation, not as ruin, but as testimony. Across continents, the oldest surviving structures share an unsettling quality. They are not crude, they are not tentative, they do not resemble experiments. They appear complete, confident and optimized, as though built by hands already familiar with failure long forgotten. The stones fit too well, the angles hold too long, the margins of error feel uncomfortably small. In some places, the earliest monumental layers sit beneath later, less refined construction. Walls laid with immense blocks are topped by masonry that is clearly inferior, assembled with smaller stones, mortar and compromise. The sequence feels reversed. Instead of progress, there is regression, an architectural forgetting layered visibly into the landscape. This reversal is often explained as a change in resources, priorities, or labour organisation. And perhaps it is. But the explanation feels thin when repeated too often, across cultures that never met. The same pattern emerges again and again. The deepest layers display the greatest technical confidence, while the later ones show adaptation rather than innovation. Precision is the most difficult detail to dismiss. Stones weighing tens or hundreds of tons are positioned with tolerances measured in millimetres, surfaces flattened to degrees that challenge even modern equipment, alignments fixed not merely to cardinal directions, but to astronomical events that repeat on long cycles. These are not aesthetic choices, they are functional decisions requiring planning, measurement, and a stable knowledge tradition. What is missing is not explanation, but context. There are no workshops preserved, no discarded prototypes, no visible learning curve carved into the earth. The structures do not show the marks of discovery, they show the marks of execution. If such knowledge emerged only once, spontaneously, at the dawn of civilization, it would be an extraordinary coincidence. If it emerged multiple times independently, the coincidence deepens. But if it survived collapse, passed down in fragments, protected by ritual, preserved in form rather than theory, then the pattern begins to feel less mysterious. Stone remembers what people forget. Unlike metals or organic materials, stone does not easily decay. It resists fire, water, and time. It does not rust or rot. For a civilization aware of impermanence, stone would be the obvious medium for preserving what mattered most. Not stories, but relationships, angles, distances, ratios, orientations between earth and sky. This may explain why ancient structures often encode knowledge rather than declare it. Mathematical relationships appear in proportions. Astronomical cycles appear in alignments. Geography becomes geometry. The message is not spoken, it is embedded. Such encoding would be especially useful after catastrophe. When language fractures and institutions fail, symbols endure. A ritual performed without understanding can still preserve timing. A monument aligned without explanation can still point to a solstice. Knowledge can survive without being recognized as knowledge. This challenges the way modern inquiry often approaches ancient architecture. We look for purpose in function, temples, tombs, fortresses. But these categories may be later interpretations imposed on structures whose original role was more abstract. Markers of time, memory, and orientation in a world that had proven itself unstable. If civilization had been reset before, the builders who came after would not see these structures as textbooks, They would see them as sacred, untouchable, inherited from an age beyond memory. They would build near them, reuse them, revere them, without reproducing the knowledge that made them possible. This reverence is visible everywhere. Older foundations are left intact while newer cultures build around them. Stones are incorporated rather than dismantled. Myths arise to explain their presence, often attributing them to gods, giants, or ancestors who lived in a time when the world worked differently. And perhaps it did. The uncomfortable implication is not that ancient people were more advanced than we are, but that advancement itself may not be rare. What may be rare is continuity, the ability to sustain complexity across environmental thresholds that do not care about intelligence or intention. In this light, monumental stonework becomes less a triumph and more a warning, a message left by hands that understood loss, hands that chose durability over expansion, geometry over comfort, alignment over ornament. When modern observers ask how such structures were built, the deeper question may be why they were built that way, why so much effort was placed into permanence in a world that had already erased itself at least once. The answer may lie not in confidence, but in memory, a memory of collapse so complete that only what was carved into the planet itself had any chance of remaining. As this perspective settles, the stones begin to feel less like anomalies and more like survivors, not evidence of impossible technology, but of deliberate restraint, of a civilization that understood its own fragility and chose to speak quietly in a language that would not require translators. And yet even stone does not speak forever. Erosion blurs precision. Shifts distort alignment. Time does what catastrophe began. What we see now may be only the faintest echo of what was once encoded clearly, which raises a final unease. If these structures are the residue of a world that already ended, then they are not monuments to achievement but to survival after forgetting. And if we are misreading them as beginnings rather than remnants, what does that say about how we interpret our own permanence? The stones remain. They do not explain themselves. They simply endure, quietly reminding anyone willing to listen that something once stood here, complete enough to be remembered only in fragments. And fragments, when misread, often look like mysteries rather than messages. When stone reaches its limits, memory finds another vessel. It becomes fluid, adaptable, and strangely resilient. It becomes story. Not the kind meant to entertain, but the kind meant to survive being broken apart and carried across generations that no longer share the same world. Myth is often treated as invention, but its structure suggests something closer to compression. Details collapse, timelines blur, causes become characters, effects become moral lessons. What remains is not accuracy, but persistence. And when these stories are laid side by side across cultures, an unsettling consistency begins to appear. Again and again, humanity remembers a time before the present order. Not a golden age of innocence, but a prior arrangement of the world that ended abruptly. Waters rise, fire falls, darkness lingers, the sky behaves incorrectly, mountains split, the land sinks, survivors retreat to high ground, caves, vessels, or distant refuges. When the world stabilizes, they emerge into something diminished, quieter, narrower. These stories are not optimistic, they do not celebrate progress, they describe reduction. What is striking is not that floods appear in myth, but how they are framed. They are not local inconveniences, they are thresholds, moments when history itself resets, and the survivors are no longer heirs to a living civilization, but custodians of fragments. The task is not to advance, but to remember just enough. In many traditions, the survivors are instructed. They are taught agriculture, law, astronomy, measurement. These lessons are not discovered through trial, they are bestowed. The teachers are often described as outsiders, beings who arrive after the disaster or emerge when the waters recede. They do not rule indefinitely, they withdraw. This withdrawal is essential. It marks a boundary between before and after. Knowledge is given but not fully explained. The recipients understand how to use it, not how it was developed. The origin dissolves into reverence. From a modern perspective, this seems symbolic. But symbolism is precisely how information survives when direct transmission fails. A ritual can preserve timing even when its purpose is forgotten. A story can preserve sequence even when causality is lost. A god can preserve authority when no institution remains to enforce it. This is why myths so often contain technical shadows, instructions disguised as commandments, observations disguised as allegory, astronomical cycles embedded in genealogies, geological events encoded as battles between forces of order and chaos. The language shifts, but the structure remains. Comparative mythology reveals another discomforting pattern. These stories do not evolve gradually. They appear fully formed within cultures, then persist with remarkable stability. Flood narratives recorded thousands of years apart share not just themes but sequences: warning, disbelief, catastrophe, preservation, renewal. This suggests not independent invention but inheritance under constraint, and constraint implies interruption. If civilization has been reset more than once, myth would be the natural archive, not because it is accurate, but because it is portable. It can survive illiteracy. It can survive migration. It can survive fear. It adapts to new landscapes while retaining its core rhythm. This reframes the role of ancient storytellers. They were not fantasists. They were archivists working without libraries. Their task was not to explain the past, but to keep it from vanishing entirely. Precision was sacrificed so that structure could endure. Over time, the emotional weight of these stories shifts. What begins as memory becomes morality. What begins as record becomes warning. Floods become punishment. Fire becomes judgment. Collapse becomes consequence. This moralization does not invalidate the memory. It protects it. People remember stories that tell them how to live. Yet beneath the moral surface, the older pattern remains visible. Worlds end. Worlds restart. Humanity continues, smaller than before. Even the concept of time itself bends under this pressure. Many ancient cultures reject linear progression in favor of cycles. Ages turn, yugas pass, suns rise and fall. These are not philosophical abstractions. They are reflections of lived instability. A way of understanding existence on a planet that repeatedly rearranges the conditions of life. In such a worldview, collapse is not failure, it is expected. What matters is not avoiding the reset, but enduring it. Carrying something through the narrowing, leaving something behind that might still speak when language fails. This may explain why ancient myths often emphasize remembrance over innovation. Ancestors are revered not for what they built, but for what they preserved. Heroes are not conquerors, but carriers. Survivors matter more than founders. If this perspective is correct, then myth is not the opposite of history. It is history after catastrophe. History stripped of dates, names, and details that could not survive compression. What we are left with is not ignorance, but residue. The faint outline of something that once existed long enough to be lost. And this raises a quiet but persistent question. If myths remember resets, not beginnings, then what do our own stories preserve without our realizing it? What assumptions are we encoding now, believing them to be universal, when they may only belong to this phase? The danger is not that we misread the past. It is that we assume it was simple, that we mistake survival stories for origin stories, and in doing so, underestimate how much has already been erased. The myths do not ask to be believed, they ask to be noticed. They do not demand agreement, they offer pattern. And pattern, when it repeats across cultures that never shared a world, deserves attention. Because if these stories are the memory of prior resets, then they are not warnings about ancient disasters alone. They are reminders that continuity is rare, that civilization is fragile, and that forgetting is not an accident, but a feature of survival on an unstable planet. The stories fade at the edges, names dissolve, places shift, but the rhythm remains, steady and patient, waiting for another listener to wonder why humanity remembers endings more clearly than beginnings. When memory travels farther than language, it leaves traces that are not spoken at all. It settles into shapes, marks, rhythms, patterns that survive translation because they are not bound to words. This is where symbols begin to matter, not as decoration, but as carriers of continuity. Across distant regions, separated by oceans and millennia, the same forms appear. Spirals carved into stone, crossed axes, stepped motifs, serpents entwined around pillars, circles divided by precise angles. These are not images of shared animals or shared landscapes. They are abstractions, and abstraction is costly. It appears only when a culture has something specific it needs to preserve. The discomfort begins when these symbols emerge in places with no accepted contact. Their meanings shift, but their structures remain. A spiral may signify water in one tradition, time in another, rebirth in a third. Yet the form persists. It is as if the symbol is older than the story told about it. Linguistics encounters a similar unease. Certain phonetic patterns recur across ancient languages in ways that resist simple diffusion. Core words associated with counting, measurement, and orientation show echoes that are difficult to explain through coincidence alone. Not identical terms, but similar constraints, as if early languages were shaped by an inherited framework rather than invented freely. Symbols behave the same way. They constrain meaning, they limit interpretation, they reduce complexity into something stable enough to survive collapse. A symbol does not need explanation to function, it only needs repetition. In cultures that endure disruption, symbols become anchors. Ritual movements repeat what cannot be spoken. Patterns traced in sand recall relationships no longer understood. Geometry replaces narrative because geometry does not require memory of cause, only recognition of form. This may explain why some of the oldest symbols are mathematical in nature, ratios encoded in art, symmetry embedded in ornament, proportions repeated across architecture, textiles and tools. These are not aesthetic accidents, they are habits of mind, evidence of a worldview shaped by measurement. Measurement implies comparison. Comparison implies reference, and reference implies continuity across time. A culture that measures carefully is a culture that remembers something precise enough to be worth preserving. The question then becomes unsettling. What was being remembered? If civilization has reset before, then symbols would have been the safest vessels for fragments of prior knowledge. They do not announce themselves as information. They blend into belief. They can be carried without understanding. They survive censorship, reinterpretation, and fear. Over time, symbols harden. Their original context dissolves. They become sacred, forbidden, or decorative. Their repetition continues even as their function is forgotten. What remains is pattern without explanation. This is visible in sacred geometry, where shapes recur across traditions that never shared theology. The same ratios appear in temples, manuscripts, and city plans. The same alignments appear in monuments separated by continents, not because of shared religion, but because of shared inheritance filtered through loss. Skeptics argue that humans naturally gravitate towards symmetry and simple forms, that the mind finds comfort in circles and lines, and this is true, but insufficient. Comfort does not explain precision. Preference does not explain recurrence at scale. Something more selective is at work. Symbols persist not because they are pleasing, but because they are useful. They organize perception. They encode relationships between space and time. They compress complex systems into manageable forms. In a post-collapse world, such compression would be essential. Imagine a society rebuilding after a reset. Writing is gone. Archives are gone. Specialists are gone. But rituals remain. Crafts remain. Stories remain. In these practices, symbols would quietly carry what could not be rebuilt immediately. Orientation to seasons, counting of cycles, awareness of thresholds. This process would repeat with each collapse. Symbols would be inherited, reinterpreted, simplified, moralized, and aestheticized. Yet their core structures would endure, accumulating layers of meaning rather than losing form. Eventually, modern observers would encounter them as puzzles, as curiosities, as art. The original function would be debated, dismissed, or romanticized, but the persistence itself would remain unexplained. This raises a subtle but important distinction. Innovation creates novelty. Inheritance creates constraint. Symbols belong to the second category. They limit the ways a culture can forget. In this light, the global repetition of certain symbolic forms suggests not a single lost civilization, but a repeating process. Collapse, compression, transmission, re-emergence, each cycle altering the surface while preserving the underlying grammar. The danger lies in mistaking this grammar for coincidence, in assuming that repetition implies simplicity rather than depth, in overlooking the possibility that humanity has been speaking to itself across resets, using a language durable enough to survive catastrophe. If so, then symbols are not relics of ignorance. They are residues of resilience, evidence that something once mattered enough to be carried forward when almost nothing else could be. And yet symbols also hide as much as they reveal. They protect knowledge by obscuring it. They ensure survival by preventing misuse. They demand patience rather than mastery. In a world repeatedly proven unstable, this may have been intentional. The uncomfortable implication is that we may still be surrounded by messages we cannot fully read, patterns inherited without instructions, alignments repeated without context, forms preserved without memory. If civilization has reset before, then our present understanding may be layered atop misunderstandings just as ancient as the symbols themselves. We may be interpreting echoes as inventions, residues as origins. The symbols do not correct us. They wait. They endure reinterpretation. They survive being misunderstood. They have done so before. And perhaps that is their purpose. Not to inform, but to persist. Not to explain, but to remain recognizable when everything else dissolves. As the symbols continue to surround us, carved, painted, repeated, ignored, they invite a quieter question. Not what they mean, but what kind of world required meaning to be carried this way? And whether our own symbols, too, are already preparing to outlast us, carrying fragments of this moment into a future that may not remember why they mattered. When symbols no longer suffice, the body itself becomes a record, not consciously, not deliberately, but through subtle irregularities written into bone, brain, and behaviour. Biology, like stone and story, remembers in its own way, and sometimes what it remembers does not align with the timelines we prefer. Human evolution is often presented as a smooth ascent, a gradual refinement shaped by natural selection, acting patiently over immense spans of time. Yet when examined closely, the record refuses to remain smooth. It breaks, it accelerates, it pauses. Certain changes arrive too quickly, while others remain inexplicably static for tens of thousands of years. One of the most unsettling patterns is the sudden emergence of cognitive complexity. Symbolic thought, abstract language, art, and advanced social coordination appear in bursts rather than increments. Long periods of relative stability are followed by rapid transformation, as though something latent had been released rather than invented. This is not how slow adaptation typically behaves. The human brain itself carries traces of this tension. Its energy demands are enormous, far out of proportion to its immediate survival value in prehistoric environments. Such a costly organ would normally be penalized unless its advantages were both immediate and essential. Yet the brain expands rapidly, then stabilizes. It does not continue growing indefinitely. It plateaus. Why stop? One explanation suggests that the environment no longer rewarded further expansion. Another suggests that the necessary conditions for developing additional complexity were removed. Infrastructure matters. Knowledge systems matter. Social density matters. Without them, cognitive potential compresses into narrower channels. If civilization had existed before and collapsed, the survivors would inherit bodies shaped for a world that no longer existed. Capabilities would remain, but the context required to express them fully would be gone. Intelligence would persist, but its direction would change. This may explain why early humans appear simultaneously capable and constrained. They create art, music, burial rituals, and long-distance trade remarkably early. Yet these behaviors do not intensify continuously. They stabilize, they repeat, they become traditional rather than experimental. Tradition, in this sense, may be a biological adaptation to uncertainty. When the future is unreliable, repetition becomes safer than innovation. What worked once is preserved. What failed is forgotten. Over time, this produces cultures rich in meaning but cautious in change. There are also anatomical anomalies that resist easy explanation. Certain skeletal structures appear, disappear, and reappear across human populations. Traits associated with endurance, vocal complexity, and fine motor control emerge rapidly, then remain consistent. Evolution seems to hesitate, as if waiting for conditions that no longer arrive. Even our emotional architecture hints at inheritance under strain. Humans exhibit deep anxiety around instability. Floods, darkness, isolation, loss of shelter. These fears are not evenly distributed across species. They feel specific, ancestral, rehearsed, as though remembered rather than learned. The same is true of social behavior. Humans instinctively form hierarchies, rituals, and symbolic systems, even in the absence of external pressure. We organize space, we mark time, we assign meaning. These tendencies appear too quickly, too reliably, to be purely reactive. It is as if the species carries a memory of organization even when circumstances no longer demand it. From this perspective, biological evolution and cultural collapse are not separate processes. They interact. A reset does not erase the body. It reshapes its priorities. Traits that supported complex societies may persist long after those societies vanish, leaving behind capabilities searching for context. This may be why humans repeatedly rebuild towards similar patterns. Agriculture emerges independently. Urban planning reappears. Monumental construction returns. Writing is reinvented. These are not inevitable outcomes of intelligence. They are familiar solutions rediscovered under constraint. The discomfort lies in the possibility that we're not inventing these solutions for the first time, but remembering them imperfectly, that our biology is tuned not just by nature, but by prior cultural environments that no longer exist. If so, then evolutionary leaps may coincide not only with environmental pressures, but with moments of recovery. When conditions briefly allow complexity to resurface, latent capacities express themselves rapidly. When conditions collapse again, those capacities retreat into ritual, art, and myth. This would produce exactly the pattern observed: bursts of advancement followed by long plateaus. Not because humans stopped thinking, but because the world stopped supporting certain kinds of thinking. The idea unsettles because it blurs the boundary between prehistory and history. It suggests that what we call modern behavior may be older than we admit, recurring whenever circumstances permit. and that what we call primitive may simply be intelligence operating under severe compression. In this light, extinction becomes ambiguous. A civilization may end without its people disappearing. The body carries on, the brain persists, only the scaffolding collapses. And when that scaffolding collapses, the species adapts not by regressing, but by narrowing. It conserves energy, it simplifies expression, it protects memory through repetition rather than expansion. This narrowing may also explain the persistent human longing for origins, the sense that something was lost, that the world was once larger, more coherent, more meaningful. This longing appears across cultures, independent of material conditions. It is not nostalgia for a known past, but for a remembered one. If Earth has reset civilization more than once, then the human body may be one of the few continuous witnesses, altered, adapted, constrained, but never entirely emptied of what it once supported. This raises a final, uneasy possibility that our biology is not fully adapted to this version of the world, that parts of us are tuned for a complexity we have not yet rebuilt, or may no longer be able to sustain. And if that is true, then the question is not how advanced we can become, but how many times we have already reached a similar threshold, only to be narrowed again by forces indifferent to intention. The body does not argue, it simply carries forward what it can, and in doing so, it hints, quietly, persistently, that intelligence may not be as new as we believe, nor as secure as we hope. It waits, as it always has, for conditions to change. When memory outgrows the body, it seeks the sky, not as escape, but as reference. The heavens change slowly enough to outlast generations, yet predictably enough to be trusted. For a civilization that has learned, perhaps painfully, that the ground cannot be relied upon, the sky becomes the most stable archive available. Ancient peoples watched it with a patience that feels difficult to reconcile with the fragile conditions assumed for their lives. They tracked motions too slow to notice within a single lifetime. They marked cycles that required centuries of continuity. They noticed shifts so subtle that even today they are often dismissed as modern discoveries. This attention was not casual, it was sustained. One such shift is the slow wobble of Earth's axis, known as precession. Over roughly 26,000 years, the orientation of the planet changes, altering the backdrop of stars against which seasons unfold. To recognize this pattern requires long-term observation, careful record-keeping, and a conceptual framework capable of linking generations that will never meet. And yet, knowledge of this cycle appears encoded in ancient structures and traditions long before telescopes or modern mathematics, not described explicitly, but embedded in alignments, myths, and numerical systems that quietly point to an awareness of deep time. This awareness raises an uncomfortable question. Who was watching long enough to notice? The sky itself does not reset easily. Catastrophes that flood continents or darken the atmosphere do not erase celestial mechanics. After collapse, the stars return to their positions. The cycles resume. For survivors seeking orientation in a changed world, the heavens offer continuity when everything else feels broken. This may explain why astronomy and cosmology appear so early in human cultural expression. Stone circles aligned to solstices, temples oriented to equinoxes. Myths structured around planetary motions, calendars calibrated with remarkable accuracy. These are not luxuries, they are anchors. In a world recovering from disruption, timekeeping is survival. Knowing when seasons shift determines whether crops fail or endure. Knowing when floods return determines where to settle. Knowing where the sun rises and sets restores a sense of order to a landscape that may no longer resemble memory. Yet some of the astronomical knowledge attributed to ancient cultures exceeds what is strictly necessary for agriculture. It extends into cycles that span thousands of years, into alignments that will not complete for generations, into cosmic patterns whose relevance is not immediately practical? Why preserve what cannot be used? One possibility is that such knowledge was inherited rather than discovered, that it mattered once under conditions no longer present, that it was preserved because it had already proven its value, even if the reason was no longer remembered. Astronomical myths often support this interpretation. They speak not just of seasons, but of ages, of worlds measured by stars that no longer occupy the same positions, of epochs ending when the sky changes its posture. These are not observations one would make casually. They suggest a civilization attentive to long cycles and aware of thresholds. In this context, the sky becomes a clock not just for time, but for history. A way to measure when worlds begin and end. This would be especially meaningful if civilization had reset before. If collapse coincided with celestial events, or if certain alignments marked periods of instability, then preserving that knowledge would become essential, not to prevent disaster, but to recognize it. Modern science often treats ancient astronomy as symbolic or ceremonial, but ceremony itself may be a memory device. A way to rehearse important information until it becomes reflexive, movements repeated, dates marked, stories told at specific times. Knowledge becomes habit. Habit survives disruption. Even after writing is lost, rituals remain. Even after institutions fail, calendars persist. The sky does not care who is watching it. It continues. This reliability would make it the ideal reference frame for a culture aware of impermanence. If civilization had never collapsed before, such fixation on deep cycles would be difficult to explain. Immediate survival would dominate attention. Long-term patterns would be irrelevant. But if collapse had already occurred, if the present world was known to be temporary, then watching the sky would feel urgent. It would be the only stable map available. This perspective casts ancient monuments in a different light. They are not merely observatories or temples. They are reminders, fixed points in a shifting world. Messages carved into stone and aligned to stars saying only this: time does not move the way you think it does. And perhaps this is why ancient cosmologies often emphasize repetition over progression. Ages turn. Worlds are born and destroyed. The universe breathes in cycles. These ideas are not metaphysical speculation alone. They may be reflections of lived experience filtered through celestial observation. If Earth has reset civilization more than once, the sky would have been there each time, unchanged enough to remember what the ground forgot. Those who watched it closely may have learned to see warning in repetition, to feel unease not in novelty, but in familiar alignments returning. This may also explain why certain dates and positions recur across traditions with no direct contact. Not because of shared belief, but because of shared inheritance of attention. The same sky invites the same questions when the same losses have already occurred. The unsettling implication is that ancient astronomy may not be a record of first discovery, but of recognition. Recognition of cycles that had already proven consequential. Recognition of patterns associated with endings rather than beginnings. If so, then our modern fascination with deep time is not new. It is a return, a rediscovery of questions once asked under far more precarious conditions. The sky has always offered perspective. It shrinks human ambition. It stretches memory. It refuses to belong to any single age. For a species navigating repeated resets, this refusal would be comforting. As this realization settles, the stars feel less like distant objects and more like witnesses. Silent, indifferent, enduring. They have seen civilizations rise and fall without changing their rhythm, and perhaps that is why they were trusted. Not because they could save anyone, but because they would still be there afterward. If civilization is fragile, the sky is not. And if memory must survive collapse, it will look upward, marking time not by human achievement, but by cycles that ignore it. The stars do not warn, they do not explain, they simply repeat. And in that repetition, they quietly ask whether we are watching them for the first time, or merely remembering how. When the sky's no longer enough, when even the stars feel too distant to hold what must be remembered, knowledge turns inward. It seeks shelter. It hides inside walls, institutions and rules about who is allowed to know. This is where memory becomes selective, and forgetting begins to look deliberate. Throughout history, moments of cultural rupture are often followed by periods of intense consolidation. Knowledge that was once dispersed becomes centralized. Oral traditions are written down, but only partially. Archives are created, but access narrows. What survives is not the totality of what was known, but what is deemed safe to carry forward. This narrowing does not require malice. It requires fear. After collapse, whether caused by environmental shock, social fragmentation, or external pressure, stability becomes the highest priority. Systems that promise order gain influence. Systems that question continuity become dangerous. In such climates, uncertainty is treated not as a question to explore, but as a threat to manage. The record shows this pattern repeating, periods of intellectual openness followed by contraction. Libraries built, then restricted. Texts copied, then edited. Histories written, then standardized. What does not fit the emerging narrative is not always destroyed. Sometimes it is simply left uncopied, allowed to fade quietly. This process is subtle. It does not look like erasure from the inside. It looks like curation. Over generations, curated memory hardens into orthodoxy. What remains feels complete because alternatives are no longer visible. The absence of contradiction is mistaken for certainty, and the past becomes smoother, more linear, easier to teach. Yet even within these systems, traces of discomfort persist. Marginal notes, heretical interpretations, myths labelled as allegory rather than record. Scholars who hint at older timelines without naming them. The tension is never fully resolved. It is managed. One of the most telling signs of this management is the recurring loss of foundational texts. Not secondary commentaries or popular stories, but original works that anchor entire traditions. They vanish in fires, invasions, reforms, and reorganizations, sometimes by accident, sometimes during moments of transition when priorities shift. Each loss compresses memory further. What remains afterward often reads like a summary of a summary. Conclusions without their underlying debates, results without their methods, timelines without their uncertainties. This creates the illusion of coherence, but only by removing depth. In such a landscape, the idea of previous resets becomes uncomfortable. It introduces too much uncertainty. It suggests that history is not a straight path, but a fragile thread repeatedly snapped and retied. For institutions built on continuity, this implication is destabilizing. So the past is simplified. Cycles become metaphors. Catastrophes become localized. Advanced knowledge attributed to coincidence or divine inspiration. Anything that implies prior complexity is reframed as anomaly rather than pattern. This reframing does not require conspiracy. It requires incentive. Stability rewards narratives that support legitimacy. Education favors clarity over ambiguity. Authority prefers foundations that do not tremble. Over time, this preference reshapes collective memory, not through force, but through repetition. What is taught is what is remembered. What is remembered becomes what feels real. And yet, some knowledge resists full containment. It survives at the edges, in comparative studies, in interdisciplinary questions, in the discomfort scholars feel when evidence does not align cleanly. These are the pressure points where older possibilities continue to press upward. The existence of such pressure suggests that forgetting has limits, that not everything can be smoothed away, that certain questions return no matter how often they are set aside. If civilization has reset before, then each reset would not only erase infrastructure, but destabilize narratives. After recovery, new systems of knowledge would form, inheriting fragments from before while redefining their meaning. Over time, these systems would grow confident, unaware of the compression that shaped them. Eventually, they too would face disruption. In this sense, history is not written by the victors alone, but by the survivors of collapse. Those who rebuild decide what matters. Those decisions shape what future generations are allowed to ask. This does not mean truth is intentionally hidden. It means truth is filtered through necessity, through fear of instability, through desire for order, through exhaustion. The result is a past that feels complete, but strangely thin, a narrative that answers many questions while avoiding others, a sense that something has been lost without a clear record of its loss. The discomfort this creates is familiar. It surfaces whenever new discoveries complicate established timelines, whenever artifacts appear too early, whenever myths align too closely with geology, whenever knowledge seems to arrive without preparation. In such moments, the question is not whether history is wrong, but whether it is incomplete by design, not as deception, but as adaptation. A civilization that has survived collapse may prioritize coherence over accuracy. It may choose stories that stabilize rather than stories that unsettle. Over time, this choice becomes invisible, and so the possibility of multiple resets remains at the margins, not denied outright, but never fully integrated, present as a whisper rather than a framework. Perhaps this is inevitable. Perhaps no civilization can fully acknowledge its own fragility without undermining the structures that hold it together. Perhaps forgetting is not a failure of memory, but a survival strategy. If so, then the gaps in our history are not accidents. They are symptoms, signs of a species that rebuilds by narrowing its focus, then slowly widens it again until the next disruption. What matters then is not whether the past has been curated, but whether we are willing to notice the seams, to recognize where continuity feels forced, to ask why certain questions feel persistently unwelcome. Because if history has been reset before, it was not only the world that changed, the way we remember changed with it. And memory, once shaped by fear of collapse, rarely advertises what it has chosen to leave behind. When memory becomes authority, it begins to speak with a single voice. What was once a chorus of interpretations narrows into doctrine. What was once uncertain becomes settled. This is the moment when history stops asking questions and starts issuing answers. Power has always understood the value of narrative, not because stories are fragile, but because they are formative. They shape identity. They establish legitimacy. They define what is possible, and more importantly, what is unthinkable. In the aftermath of disruption, when societies are desperate for stability, those who offer coherence gain influence quickly. Religion, empire, and scholarship often converge in these moments, not as conspirators, but as partners in restoration. Each provides something essential: moral order, administrative structure, and intellectual framework. Together they rebuild meaning from fragments, but rebuilding requires selection. Certain versions of the past are easier to govern than others. Histories that emphasize linear progress reinforce authority. They suggest inevitability. They imply that the present order is the natural outcome of everything that came before. In contrast, histories that emphasize cycles, collapses, and forgotten heights introduce discomfort. They weaken the sense of permanence. They invite comparison. So the past is organized, timelines are fixed, beginnings are chosen, endings are softened. Events that suggest regression are reframed as moral failure rather than systemic fragility. Catastrophe becomes punishment instead of pattern. This transformation does not happen through erasure alone. More often, it occurs through reinterpretation. Myths are retained but drained of historical weight. Cycles are spiritualized. Ancient warnings are moralized. What once described collapse becomes instruction on obedience. Over time, the symbolic language that once carried compressed memory is repurposed. It becomes allegory rather than archive. The possibility that it might reflect real prior worlds fades into abstraction. Questioning this abstraction becomes suspect, even dangerous, because it threatens the coherence so carefully rebuilt. Education reinforces this narrowing. Complexity is replaced with clarity. Ambiguity is treated as immaturity. Students are taught what to know, not how much remains unknown. The past becomes a sequence of achievements rather than interruptions. Yet even within authoritative systems, cracks remain visible. Doctrinal disputes erupt over interpretation. Heresies emerge not because people invent new ideas, but because old questions resurface. Scholars notice inconsistencies. Texts resist harmonization. Myths refuse to align perfectly with sanctioned timelines. These tensions reveal something important. Control over history is never total. Memory compresses, but it does not disappear. Fragments persist in art, ritual, language, and architecture. They surface when pressure shifts. If civilization has reset before, then each recovery would produce a similar dynamic. A need for order, a fear of instability, a preference for narratives that support continuity. Over time, these narratives harden into tradition. Tradition becomes identity. Identity resists revision. This resistance is not malicious. It is protective. Societies that constantly question their own foundations risk paralysis. To function, they must believe in their story, even if that story is incomplete. But incompleteness has consequences. It creates blind spots. It discourages recognition of patterns that do not fit the authorized frame. It makes certain discoveries feel threatening rather than enlightening. This may explain why evidence suggesting prior advanced cycles often meets discomfort rather than curiosity. Not because it is inherently implausible, but because it destabilizes the idea of uniqueness. It suggests that collapse is not an aberration, but a recurring condition. For institutions built on permanence, this is difficult to absorb. And yet, history itself offers precedent. Empires fall, religions fragment, knowledge systems reorganize. What feels eternal from within always appears temporary in retrospect. The authority that defines history today becomes a chapter tomorrow. Seen from this distance, the control of memory appears less like manipulation and more like habit. Each civilization inherits a narrowed past and adds its own interpretations. Over time, the narrowing compounds. Earlier resets fade beneath later ones. Eventually, the idea that civilization could have existed before the known timeline feels alien, even offensive. It threatens the assumption that the present is unprecedented, that we stand at the peak rather than on a ledge. But authority cannot erase the planet's memory. Geological layers persist. Astronomical cycles repeat. Biological patterns endure. These are records no institution controls. They do not argue. They simply exist, waiting to be compared. When such comparisons become unavoidable, narratives adapt again. New frameworks emerge. Old certainties soften. What was once dismissed becomes debated. The cycle continues. If Earth has reset civilization more than once, then no system of authority has ever been final. Each has operated within a temporary window of stability, interpreting fragments inherited from before, while unknowingly preparing fragments for those who will come after. This does not diminish the achievements of any age. It contextualizes them. It suggests that greatness is not permanent, and that memory itself is a resource shaped by scarcity. Perhaps the most revealing question is not why institutions shape history, but why we expect them not to. Stability demands story. Story demands selection. Selection demands forgetting. And forgetting, in a world that resets itself, may be the most human adaptation of all. As the structures of authority continue to speak with confidence, the quieter record remains beneath them. in stone, in symbols, in the body, in the sky. It does not challenge, it waits, because authority changes, but patterns endure. Once authority settles into habit, another voice begins to surface, not loudly, not all at once, but persistently. It is the voice of pattern, not the kind that belongs to any single culture, but the kind that emerges when ideas recur independently, separated by distance, language, and belief. Philosophers, long before modern science, sensed that history might not move in a straight line. They spoke instead of ages, turns, and returns. Time, in their view, did not advance toward a final state. It revolved. What rose would fall, what fell would rise again, altered but familiar. These were not predictions. They were observations shaped by long attention. In India, the concept of repeating ages describes worlds that grow complex, fragment, collapse, and renew. In Greece, thinkers imagined great cycles in which civilizations are periodically erased by fire or flood. In Mesoamerica, time is counted not toward an end, but through successive creations and destructions. These frameworks differ in detail, but they share a refusal to believe in permanence. What is striking is not their mythology, but their restraint. None of these traditions claim that the present world is exceptional. None assume that progress is guaranteed. Instead, they suggest that collapse is not a deviation, but an interval. Such ideas feel unsettling to modern sensibilities because they resist closure. They imply that no achievement is final, no system immune. They place human ambition inside a rhythm larger than intention. From a philosophical perspective, this rhythm solves a problem that linear history cannot. It explains why complexity appears abruptly, why knowledge sometimes seems inherited rather than invented, why cultures separated by time reach similar conclusions using different languages. If civilization has reset before, then the recurrence of similar structures is not coincidence, it is convergence, the rediscovery of solutions shaped by shared constraints. This convergence appears in governance, architecture, mathematics, cosmology. Societies independently arrive at hierarchies, calendars, grids, codes, and monuments. These are not arbitrary. They are stable arrangements in an unstable world. They persist because they work. Over long spans of time, the same problems return: resource distribution, social coordination, memory preservation, environmental risk. Each cycle invites similar responses, refined or simplified depending on conditions. What looks like innovation may be recognition. This reframes the idea of originality. In a cyclical world, originality lies not in creating something new, but in adapting something old to new constraints. Memory becomes a tool rather than a burden. Philosophers who sensed this often expressed it indirectly. They spoke of eternal return, of ages repeating under different names. They did not claim literal recurrence of identical events. They pointed instead to structural recurrence, the same tensions, the same thresholds, the same endings approached from different angles. Such thinking does not require belief in a lost golden age. It requires only attention to rhythm, to the way complexity accumulates until it becomes brittle, to the way systems grow efficient and then fragile, to the way success creates conditions for failure. From this view, collapse is not punishment or accident. It is release, a resetting of complexity to manageable levels, a clearing that allows patterns to re-emerge without the weight of accumulated structures. This idea unsettles because it removes moral framing. Collapse is not deserved. It is not avoidable through virtue alone. It is structural. It emerges from interactions too complex to control indefinitely. If Earth has reset civilization more than once, then philosophy may have preserved this insight long before evidence could support it. Not as doctrine, but as caution. A reminder that stability is temporary and that memory matters more than accumulation. Modern thought often resists this. It prefers linear narratives of improvement. It invests identity in progress. It treats setbacks as errors rather than phases. Yet even now the language of cycles returns. Economic cycles, ecological cycles, technological cycles. The intuition persists even when resisted. What changes is scale. Ancient thinkers applied cycles to civilizations and worlds. Modern frameworks often restrict them to markets or ecosystems. The idea that civilization itself might be cyclical remains uncomfortable. Perhaps this discomfort arises because acknowledging cycles requires humility. It asks us to see ourselves not as culmination, but as participants, not as exception, but as iteration. And iteration implies memory. If cycles repeat, then the most valuable inheritance is not material wealth, but understanding of thresholds. Knowledge of when growth becomes risk. Awareness of when complexity outpaces resilience. Ancient philosophies often emphasize moderation for this reason. Balance, measure, harmony. These are not moral ideals alone, they are survival strategies in a world that has already erased excess before. If such philosophies emerge from a lived experience of collapse, then they are not abstract musings, they are distilled lessons. Warnings encoded in language broad enough to survive reinterpretation. The challenge is that lessons survive longer than contexts. Later generations inherit caution, without remembering why it was necessary. Over time, restraint feels unnecessary. Expansion resumes. The cycle continues. This does not mean collapse is inevitable in a fixed sense. It means risk accumulates invisibly. It means stability breeds confidence, and confidence breeds fragility. If civilization has reset before, then philosophy may be one of the few records that noticed without naming, that sensed pattern without insisting on proof, that preserved rhythm where detail could not survive. As this perspective settles, the question shifts once more, not whether cycles exist, but whether they can be recognized in time, whether memory can interrupt rhythm rather than merely record it, and whether a civilization aware of prior resets would behave differently, or whether awareness itself is simply another phase, destined to fade as confidence returns. The philosophers left no instructions, only reflections, only patterns. They did not claim to know when the next turning would arrive, they only suggested that it would. When patterns refuse to remain abstract, they surface as objects, quietly at first, almost apologetically, an artifact where none should exist, a technique appearing too early, a material behaving in ways that seem out of place in its assigned era. These moments do not announce a lost civilization, they simply introduce doubt. The doubt is subtle because most of these objects are not spectacular. They are not machines or impossible devices, they are small things, cuts in stone that are too clean, alloys that behave too consistently, surfaces polished beyond practical necessity. They do not break the laws of physics, they challenge expectations. What makes them unsettling is context. They appear in layers where such refinement is not supposed to exist, or they appear fully formed, without nearby evidence of development. A technique arrives mature, as though it had already been practiced elsewhere, sometime earlier, somewhere now gone. Archaeology often responds cautiously to such findings, and with reason. Context can deceive, natural processes can mimic intention. Later intrusions can confuse timelines. Skepticism is necessary. Yet skepticism becomes strained when the same anomalies recur across different sites, cultures, and materials. Stonework provides a recurring example. Certain ancient surfaces display uniformity that implies controlled abrasion rather than simple percussion. Hard stones are shaped with precision that suggests more than trial and error hammering. The marks left behind are not chaotic, they are consistent. The usual explanations, lost techniques, skilled craftsmanship, long labour are not incorrect. But they are incomplete. Skill explains execution, not origin. Labour explains persistence, not initial knowledge. The question remains, how did such methods arise so cleanly, so early, and then disappear? Metallurgy introduces similar tension. Alloys appear whose properties require controlled ratios and temperatures. Some are rediscovered centuries later, independently, using different methods. The knowledge does not travel linearly. It flickers, appears, vanishes, returns. This flickering resembles inheritance more than invention. A fragment remembered without its theoretical foundation. A recipe followed without understanding why it works. Such practices can endure briefly, then degrade as conditions change. This degradation is important. If advanced techniques existed prior to a reset, their survival would be uneven. Tools dependent on infrastructure would vanish first. Techniques embedded in habit would linger longer. Over time, what remains would look inconsistent, advanced in some areas, rudimentary in others. From a modern standpoint, this inconsistency feels wrong. We expect technological progress to be uniform, but collapse does not erase evenly. It fractures. Consider materials that require supply chains. Once disrupted, such materials become impossible to reproduce, regardless of skill. What survives instead are techniques compatible with scarcity. Stone replaces metal. Geometry replaces machinery. Knowledge compresses into what can be done with minimal dependency. This compression could explain why some ancient artifacts seem anomalously advanced relative to their surroundings. They may not represent the peak of that culture, but the remnants of something already narrowed by loss. Even the absence of certain tools can be telling. Some tasks appear accomplished without leaving behind expected intermediary devices. This suggests methods that do not align with modern assumptions. Not impossible methods, but unfamiliar ones. Familiarity itself becomes a bias. Modern observers tend to imagine ancient innovation proceeding toward modern solutions, but a civilization shaped by previous collapse might pursue different priorities. Durability over speed, simplicity over scalability, techniques that survive interruption rather than optimize output. Such priorities would produce artifacts that look strange to us, because they were not designed to lead anywhere, they were designed to endure. This perspective also reframes the idea of technological ceilings. Perhaps some ancient cultures did not lack capability but restraint. Perhaps they avoided paths that had proven unsustainable before. Perhaps certain technologies were abandoned intentionally, not because they were impossible, but because they were remembered as dangerous. This idea is difficult to test, but it aligns with patterns observed in both material culture and myth. Tools appear, then are abandoned. Knowledge is hinted at, then withdrawn. Stories speak of gifts that should not be repeated, of powers that require limitation. If civilization has reset before, then technological memory would be fragmented not just by loss, but by choice. Survivors might avoid rebuilding systems associated with collapse. What remains would feel selective, cautious, incomplete. From this angle, anomalous artifacts are not evidence of a single lost advanced civilization. They are traces of multiple recoveries, each recovery carrying forward different fragments, each fragment shaped by what could survive and what was deemed worth preserving. This would produce a patchwork record, not a clean progression, but a mosaic of mismatched capabilities. Exactly what the archaeological record shows. The discomfort arises when we insist on coherence, when we assume that knowledge must advance or retreat uniformly. Collapse violates that assumption. It creates uneven survival, and uneven survival creates anomalies. The anomalies do not demand belief. They demand patience. They invite questions that resist simple answers. They suggest that our frameworks for interpreting the past may be too narrow to account for repeated disruption. If Earth has reset civilization more than once, then the material record would look precisely like this: incomplete, contradictory, advanced and simple in the same breath. a history not erased, but thinned. And thinning leaves edges. Edges where something does not fit, where an object feels out of time, where a technique seems to appear without ancestry, where a question lingers longer than it should. These edges are not proof. They are invitations. Invitations to consider that the past may not be a straight road, but a landscape repeatedly walked, reshaped, and partially forgotten. The artifacts remain where they are, indifferent to interpretation. They do not insist on a story. They simply exist, slightly misaligned with expectation. And in that misalignment, they whisper, not of impossibility, but of repetition. There are moments in history when a voice appears briefly, speaks out of alignment with its time, and then fades. Not silenced dramatically, not erased by force, but absorbed into obscurity. These voices are often labelled eccentric, speculative, or premature, yet when examined together, they form a pattern as suggestive as any artifact or myth. Throughout the last few centuries, scholars, explorers, and observers have occasionally stumbled upon evidence that did not fit accepted timelines. They noticed structures that seemed older than expected, maps that implied forgotten knowledge, traditions that hinted at deeper antiquity. Often, they did not claim certainty. They expressed unease. What followed was rarely confrontation. More often, it was quiet marginalization. Their ideas were deemed unproductive, unfalsifiable, or irrelevant. Funding moved elsewhere. Attention shifted. The questions remained unanswered, not because they were disproven, but because they were inconvenient. This pattern reveals something subtle about how knowledge advances. Progress does not always move toward truth. It moves toward consensus. And consensus forms most easily around ideas that reinforce existing frameworks. Those who question the uniqueness of the present or the simplicity of the past often find themselves isolated. Not because they are wrong, but because their questions destabilize narratives that others rely on for coherence. To suggest prior resets is to suggest that collapse is not hypothetical. It has already happened. Many of these marginal voices notice the same things from different angles. The absence of expected developmental stages, the recurrence of advanced ideas in unexpected contexts, the strange confidence of early civilizations. They did not always agree with one another. What united them was discomfort. Some approached the problem through geology, noticing cycles of sudden change that could erase societies without leaving obvious scars. Others approached it through linguistics, sensing inheritance where invention was assumed. Others still through cartography, mythology, or comparative anthropology. Their conclusions varied. Some suggested lost continents, others proposed forgotten migrations. A few speculated about advanced prehistoric cultures. Most stopped short of grand claims. They asked questions instead, and questions, when persistent, can be more threatening than answers. Institutional knowledge tends to reward refinement over disruption. It values incremental improvement within established models. Ideas that require rewriting foundations are often postponed indefinitely, not rejected outright, but deferred. This deferral creates a kind of intellectual limbo. Observations are acknowledged but not integrated. Anomalies are catalogued but not contextualized. Over time, they become curiosities rather than catalysts. The individuals who first raised these questions often disappear from mainstream discourse. Their work is cited selectively or reduced to footnotes. Their broader implications remain unexplored. Future researchers rediscover the same anomalies and repeat the process. This repetition mirrors the very cycles under discussion. Knowledge advances, narrows, and forgets. Then rediscovers, then narrows again. If civilization has reset before, then this pattern of intellectual narrowing may be a cultural echo of environmental collapse, a tendency to prioritize stability over exploration, to favor narratives that feel secure over those that feel unsettling. The irony is that many of these marginal voices were not radicals. They worked within available evidence. They respected method. Their discomfort arose not from imagination, but from inconsistency. The data did not align cleanly. The timelines felt compressed. The transitions felt abrupt. Rather than forcing coherence, they paused. They allowed uncertainty to remain visible. Uncertainty, however, is difficult to preserve. It demands patience. It resists closure. It invites reinterpretation. Over time, systems built on certainty naturally filter it out. This filtering does not eliminate the underlying tension. It postpones it. The same questions return in new forms, asked by new people, framed in new language. Each generation believes it is encountering them for the first time. In reality, the conversation has been ongoing, fragmented by resets both cultural and institutional. There is also a psychological cost to questioning continuity. To consider prior advanced cycles is to confront impermanence directly. It challenges the comforting belief that progress accumulates safely. It suggests that knowledge, once lost, may not be easily recovered. This awareness can feel paralyzing. It can erode motivation. Perhaps this is why such ideas are often softened, spiritualized, or mythologized. They are easier to tolerate as metaphor than as precedent. Yet some individuals persist. They continue to ask why early civilizations appear so complete, why myths align with geological events, why symbols recur globally, why technological anomalies resist tidy explanation. They do not demand answers. They hold space for the question. These voices rarely form a unified movement. They remain scattered, separated by discipline and era. But their isolation may be their strength. It prevents dogma. It preserves openness. If Earth has reset civilization more than once, then these isolated observers may represent a kind of continuity, not of knowledge, but of attention. A willingness to notice when things do not fit. Attention survives collapse better than certainty. As time passes, some of their ideas resurface, reframed by new evidence or technologies. Satellite imagery reveals structures long suspected. Climate science confirms abrupt shifts once dismissed. Genetics complicates linear models of human development. The questions gain traction again, quietly. This does not vindicate every speculation. It does not require belief in any single lost civilization. It suggests something simpler and more unsettling, that the past may be deeper, more complex and more interrupted than we are comfortable admitting. The individuals who sensed this early did not leave manifestos. They left traces, papers, notes, doubts. Their work lingers not as conclusion, but as invitation. An invitation to resist premature certainty, to accept that history may not be a clean ascent, to consider that what feels marginal now may become central later, once the framework shifts. If resets have occurred before, then recognition itself may be cyclical. Awareness rises, it fades, it returns, each time shaped by new constraints. The quiet voices do not ask to be followed. They do not claim authority. They simply remind us that when many unrelated observers feel the same unease, the unease itself deserves attention. And perhaps that is how memory survives between resets. Not through monuments or institutions, but through individuals willing to pause when the story feels too smooth. They do not solve the mystery, they keep it alive. As the fragments accumulate, a different question begins to take shape. Not about what has already been lost, but about what determines who remembers. If civilization has reset more than once, then survival alone is not the deciding factor. Something else filters what passes through the narrowing. In every collapse there are survivors. This is not in dispute. But survival does not guarantee continuity. Most survivors inherit a world reduced in scale, stripped of systems that once supported specialization and memory. What they carry forward is shaped less by intention than by circumstance. Food comes first, shelter follows, social bonds tighten. Under these conditions, knowledge competes for space. What helps endure remains. What does not becomes optional. Optional knowledge rarely survives long. This filtering creates an illusion of inevitability. Later generations assume that what remains must have been the most important. In reality, it was simply the most portable. The ability to read the sky persists because it requires no tools. Ritual survives because it binds communities. Story survives because it adapts. Mathematics survives when it can be embedded in form. What disappears are systems that depend on scale, archives, infrastructure, distributed expertise. This is why resets do not produce tabula rasa. They produce compression. Civilization does not vanish, it folds inward. And when it unfolds again, it does so unevenly. Those who rebuild inherit not a blank slate, but a distorted mirror of what came before. They see fragments and assume origins. They find remnants and call them beginnings. The memory of collapse itself often vanishes, replaced by narratives of creation. This replacement is not deceitful. It is psychological. To live in a diminished world while remembering a large one is painful. Forgetting becomes a form of mercy. Yet some traces resist forgetting. They persist because they are embedded too deeply, in instinct, in ritual timing, in spatial organization, in the unease that arises when growth accelerates too quickly. These traces do not announce themselves as memory. They feel like intuition, like tradition, like common sense. People follow them without knowing why. If civilization has reset before, then the most influential inheritance may not be technological or textual, but behavioral. Patterns of settlement, cycles of expansion and restraint, reverence for certain times, places, and limits. This inheritance shapes the future quietly. It guides decisions long after its origin has vanished. It is reinforced through success, then forgotten once stability feels secure. Eventually, confidence returns, systems expand, complexity grows, the world feels predictable again. At this stage, the inherited cautions begin to feel unnecessary. They are reinterpreted as superstition or moralism. Their practical origins are lost. This is when risk accumulates, not because people are reckless, but because memory has thinned. The conditions that once justified restraint are no longer visible. Growth accelerates beyond resilience. Systems become efficient but brittle. Redundancy disappears. From the inside, this feels like progress. From the outside, it looks familiar. If resets have occurred before, then this phase is not unique. It is part of the rhythm. Awareness fades as confidence grows. Warnings become myths. Myths become metaphors. Metaphors become decoration. Then something shifts. The shift may not arrive as a single catastrophe. It may come as cascading failures, climate instability, resource stress, social fragmentation, each manageable on its own, but together overwhelming. The systems built for efficiency struggle to adapt. At this point, memory matters again. But it is too late to rebuild what has already thinned. What remains must suffice. Those who pass through the narrowing once more will not remember us as we remember ourselves. They will inherit fragments, artifacts without context, stories without names, structures without explanation. They will look back and ask the same questions we ask now. Why did this civilization feel so confident? Why did it assume continuity? Why did it build as though nothing would interrupt? And perhaps some of them will notice the seams, the places where the story feels too smooth, the absences where development should be, the symbols repeated without clear origin. They may sense that something larger once existed, even if they cannot name it. They may carry forward habits shaped by our failures, even if they do not remember us. This is the quiet continuity of civilization across resets. Not a lineage of power or technology, but a lineage of pattern. each cycle inheriting the consequences of the last without inheriting its explanations. The unsettling possibility is that we are not exempt from this process. That awareness alone does not guarantee interruption, that knowing about prior resets may simply be another fragment passed forward, stripped of urgency. Knowledge once separated from consequence becomes curiosity. Curiosity rarely changes behavior. If Earth has reset civilization more than once, then the determining factor is not intelligence but humility, the ability to recognize thresholds before crossing them, the willingness to preserve redundancy, the courage to limit growth. These qualities are difficult to maintain in long periods of stability. They feel unnecessary, they feel pessimistic, they conflict with momentum, and so the cycle continues. Those who will remember us are not those who read our records, but those who survive the narrowing. They will inherit what can be carried, not what was cherished, was. They will remember us through the distortions imposed by loss. Perhaps they will find our monuments and misinterpret them. Perhaps they will discover our tools without understanding their systems. Perhaps they will tell stories about us that sound symbolic rather than historical. And perhaps that is how it has always been. If resets are real, then civilization is less a ladder than a tide, rising, receding, reshaping the shore, leaving behind traces that hint at previous heights. The question is not whether the tide will turn again. The question is what, if anything, will be carried forward when it does, and whether the fragments we leave behind will speak clearly, or merely whisper, as so many before them have done. At the end of every long inquiry there is a temptation to resolve, to name a cause, to draw a boundary, to decide what must be believed and what must be dismissed. But the deeper the question runs, the less useful certainty becomes. What remains instead is orientation, a way of standing within uncertainty without trying to collapse it. If Earth has reset civilization more than once, the evidence would never gather into a single proof. It would not announce itself as a revelation. It would scatter. It would whisper. It would appear as gaps where continuity should be, as repetitions where novelty is expected, as unease where confidence once felt sufficient. Perhaps that is why the idea resists conclusion. It does not belong to any one discipline. It lives between geology and myth, between biology and philosophy, between stone and story. Each offers a fragment, none offer the whole. What emerges from these fragments is not a lost empire, not a forgotten technology, not a hidden archive waiting to be uncovered. What emerges is a pattern of forgetting, a rhythm of rise, compression, and return. Civilization not as a permanent structure, but as a phase condition, something that appears under certain constraints and disappears when those constraints shift. This view does not diminish human achievement. It reframes it. It places invention inside fragility. It reminds us that intelligence does not exempt a species from its environment. That memory, not progress, may be the most difficult thing to sustain. In such a world, history is not a story of accumulation. It is a story of selection. What survives is not what mattered most, but what could endure disruption. What could be carried without explanation. What could persist without infrastructure. This explains why the past feels incomplete, why it arrives in fragments that never quite fit together, why beginnings feel abrupt and endings feel softened, why myths remember endings more vividly than origins. It also explains the strange familiarity that arises when confronting ancient remains. The sense that something has already been tried, that certain mistakes feel rehearsed, that confidence itself carries a shadow. If civilization has reset before, then the present moment is neither unique nor meaningless. It is provisional, a temporary configuration of knowledge, power, and memory, shaped by what survived the last narrowing and already shaping what might survive the next. This does not imply inevitability. Cycles are not destinies. They are tendencies. They can be interrupted, delayed, softened. But interruption requires recognition, not just of evidence, but of limits. The most dangerous illusion a civilization can hold is that continuity is guaranteed, that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to plan without humility, that growth does not require restraint, that complexity will always be supported by stable conditions. History, when viewed through the lens of resets, offers a quieter lesson. Stability is borrowed, memory is fragile, awareness fades more easily than we expect. And yet something persists across all these turns. Not technology, not an institution, a posture, the act of noticing, the willingness to question when the story feels too smooth, the instinct to look for what is missing, not just what is present. This posture may be the most durable inheritance of all. It does not depend on tools or texts. It can survive collapse because it lives in attention, in the refusal to mistake convenience for truth. Perhaps that is why these questions continue to surface, even after being set aside. Why they return in different languages, different eras, different forms. They are not anomalies. They are reminders. Reminders that civilization is not a final state, but a recurring experiment, one that can be conducted with awareness or without it, one that can value memory or dismiss it, one that can recognize its place within a larger rhythm or insist on its exception. The Earth does not require us to understand this. It will continue its cycles regardless. The question is not what the planet will do, but what we will remember while living on it. If future generations inherit only fragments of this moment, what will those fragments suggest? Will they imply confidence without caution, power without humility, knowledge without memory of its cost, or will they carry signs of restraint, of redundancy preserved, of warnings encoded quietly, not as prophecy, but as pattern? Perhaps the most meaningful legacy is not what we build, but what we choose not to forget. Not in the sense of preserving every detail, but in preserving awareness of fragility itself. The idea that civilization may have reset before does not ask for belief. It asks for attention. It invites us to stand within uncertainty without rushing to mastery, to recognize that the absence of proof is not proof of absence, especially on a planet skilled at erasure. As the inquiry ends, there is no final answer waiting. Only a horizon shaped by questions that refuse to settle. Questions that remain open not because they are unsolvable, but because they point beyond any single conclusion. The silence that follows is not empty. It is reflective, like standing among ruins at dusk, aware that others once stood there too, asking different questions under the same sky. If civilization has ended before, then this moment is not the first of its kind. And if it has not, then the possibility itself is still instructive. It reminds us to treat continuity as precious, memory as labour, and certainty as provisional. The past does not speak clearly. It never has. It leaves impressions, not instructions. It waits for attention, not agreement. And perhaps that is enough. Not to resolve the mystery, but to remain awake to it.